worry. Right, so this is the plan for today. Welcome to the third lecture. So how many of you are familiar with Meyerson theory and basically the single parameter Bayesian mechanism design set? Raise your hand if you are, and if you're not, that's fine. Okay, that's good. So we are gonna start probably, so we're gonna start with the Meyerson theory, and maybe the first half of the lecture today is just gonna be covering the specifics of how to design optimal revenue single parameter Bayesian mechanism design. And then we are going to learn a lot of tools in this part that are going to help us to design the actual mechanism, simple mechanism that we're interested in this section, which is Bayesian sequential process pricing. I'm going to explain when the time comes, but we are going to think about when there is an auctioneer who is selling one item to a sequence of arriving buyers. Their valuation for that one item are independent but non-identical. And then the goal is by posting different prices, you want to maximize your revenue or get as close as possible to an offline mechanism that had access to the entire pool of buyers and could do whatever. And then we're going to think about the same setting when rather than different prices, you are just allowed to post one single price. Then we are going to think about the symmetric setting and ask the same question: what would happen if you have one price? What would happen if rather than selling one item, you are selling multiple units of the same item? And then finally, I'm going to talk about, if the time permits, the case that is symmetric. You are selling one item, but you're allowed to change your prices and how you can actually get improved approximation factor. Finally, if, again, time permits, I'm going to talk about a variant of sequential process pricing where the ordering at which you observe the buyers is in the control of the mechanism designer. You can select in which order you want to observe the buyers and sell the item to those buyers. So this is basically the rough plan for today. It's kind of an ambitious plan. So I'm going to start from the beginning and let's see how far down this list we are going to go. Yes, Alex.
What is the last word in those three columns?
Here, this one?
The next one.
Anonymous.
Anonymous.
Yeah, uniform pricing or anonymous pricing is this practice of just posting one single price for the item. So you're not personalizing among the different buyers. And then if there is anyone who is willing to pay that price, you're going to pick one person among those that are willing to pay the price uniformly at random, charge that person with their price. So it's not doing any kind of personalization anymore. Okay? So what I'm gonna teach at the beginning is so clean and beautiful that there is no way I can mess up teaching it. And there are three reasons I really like this result. First of all, it is clean and beautiful. Second, it is from the Nobel Prize winning work of Roger Meyerson back in 1981. And the third one is Roger is next door. So you can go to the econ department and have a conversation with Roger. And I'm pretty sure if you tell him that, hey, I just learned the beautiful Meyerson demo. Can you tell me, like, what are you up to these days? And he's going to spend an hour, no matter who is at his door, explain some new ideas that he had about multidimensional mechanism design, bargaining questions, stuff like that. He's amazing. All right, so let me start by telling you what is the basic setup that we are going to think about today. So imagine that we have n buyers. Buyer I has a valuation for an item, or let's say service, denoted by VI, which is realized from a distribution Fi. We assume that this distribution Fi's are known by everyone participating in this game, the buyers, all the buyers, and also the auctioneer. So FIs are common prior distributions. And whenever it's here, I assume that these FIs are continuous atomic distributions, like the simplest setting you can think of. Now, This setting is endowed with what I call a feasibility environment, similar to what we had last time. The feasibility environment, I'm going to use curly F to denote that. It's going to be a subset of n-dimensional 0, 1 vectors, 2 to the. So for example, just to give you an example, the single item setting, then F is just basically all vector X in, let's say, 0, 1 to the n, such that summation of xi is equal to 1. And then we're going to have the k unit setting. I'm going to call it k unit single item because there's just one item, but you have multiple units of that. So that would be the setting in which x is all the vector 0, 1 to the n, such that summation of xi is exactly equal to n. For I equal to 1 to n, I equal to 1 to n. And here n is just some number, actually, okay, so k is some number. All right, so basically in this setting, you can give the service to just one single person. In this setting, you can give the service or the item to k people out of n. Okay. Now, what are we thinking about? What are the objects you are thinking about? So we are thinking about what I call a mechanism, and let me actually define that. So a mechanism M is going to be a pair of two function classes. So the first one, I'm using xi, and if you give me a second, I'm going to define this function. So xi and pi, one function for one allocation function for each bidder and one payment function for each bidder or buyer. I from 1 to n. All right. And the way to think about them is that for every I, xi is really a mapping from a vector b1 through bn to a number that is either 0 or 1. That's for what I call deterministic mechanisms. And then we are also thinking about randomized mechanisms. So every time we look at the randomized mechanism, I basically think of the probability that I gets the item, and then xib is going to be a number between 0 and 1. And this is the case of randomized mechanism. All right. But these things are called allocation functions. And in a second, we will see what is the vector b. And then the other two functions, payment function for every I have pi of e. You should think of it as a number, a real number. No matter whether you have a deterministic mechanism or random mechanism, I always use this quantity. So it's always a real number. We're calling the payment function. Okay. So now what are we are going to do with the mechanism? So we're going to play a game that has 3 stages: example stage, entrainment stage, and exposure stage. Let me explain all of those stages. There's a game between an auctioneer, let's say Rod, and buyers that are attending the auction. So in the example stage, here's what's happening. Auctioneer essentially commits to a mechanism M. So I say, hey, here's a protocol I'm gonna run. So that's the commitment stage. And then at this stage, each buyer I realizes her private value vi from the distribution fi. So now if you're buyer I, you get to see what's your value. Okay. Now we get to essentially the interim stage of this game. What's going to happen? So I'm going to run a protocol as auctioneer, which has 3 components. So the first part, I ask the buyers to report what I call a bid. Then each buyer I is going to report a number denoted by bi. So I have a vector b, b1 through b1. At this point, you should not, again, think of this as the buyers are reporting their values. They're just like reporting some number. And even you can think of the space of bid to be some wiki-wacky space. It doesn't really need to be the original space of the valuation. For simplicity, I'm thinking about this vector to be a vector in R to the n. And later, we will see using a technique called as revelation principle that without assumption, we can assume that buyers are reporting their valuation. But at this point, I just like think of them as an abstract object, as an action or a strategy that is reported by the buyers. Okay. So they report these numbers.
Yes. Sometimes if I give you participation, like people talk about ex ante participation, then I assume VI happens in the interim, but you're assuming VI also happens ex ante?
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing in the game is going to be different if you assume that VI is happening at the interim stage. I guess the way that I think about this is, I guess Warren is saying that, well, so at the ex-ante stage from the perspective of buyer, sometimes you might say that you don't know your own value. I think that is also.
And the mechanism could have participation P and then I could say P and then have participation.
Right. So if you want to consider entrance fees, then you're better off considering this as part of the interim. Actually, I agree with you that it matches the concept of interim better. Although in our treatment, it's really not that. But I agree with you. So let's say at this stage, only the commitment happens. And if I want to be very concrete, actually, everyone knows the prior, right? So I think this is the other way of saying that. So everyone knows that, well, so their values are going to be realized on this institution, but they don't know the value. Then in the interim stage, VI is going to first be realized, so each buyer knows her value, the auctioneer doesn't know these values. Then the auctioneer asks the buyers to report the bid. Now, buyer I get an allocation which is equal to xi of the entire bid vector. For example, if you think about the deterministic case, is going to be a number which is 0 or 1. 0 means that the buyer didn't get service, 1 means that the buyer got the service. And the buyer should pay a payment which is equal to pi of p.
I'm confused. So
yes,
did you move the realization to the interim state or you moved the bidding to the ex ante stage?
No. So this is the interim stage.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically, the first thing in the interim stage is everyone gets to see their value, and then they are bidding. They're bidding this vector. And then buyer gets an allocation and a payment. And the person who is responsible for this allocation to be feasible is the auction, not the buyers. So if I'm a mechanism and I say, hey, I'm gonna output always a feasible allocation, that means that, well, given the bid vector I receive, I make sure only one of these i's gets 1, and then the others in that case should be 0. Okay. Great. And then essentially, there is an ex post stage, and we are not really thinking about this in this lecture, but to just make things complete, in the ex post stage, everyone knows what happened in the game. So basically everyone gets to see the entire valuation vector V and all the allocation of gains. But this is enough with the commitment assumption for everyone to simulate the game. So think of it as, hey, so after I attend the mechanism, an allocation payment is determined, and then I know after effect that, hey, each buyer had this particular valuation for the service. But we are not gonna actually use the expose stage language. All right, so what do we know about the buyers?
I have one question.
Yes.
So you said in expose stage, everyone can simulate the game, but simulating the game would also require them to know how M was designed or how the allocation and payment functions were designed. So that's more information than
So
this.
when the auctioneer commits to a mechanism, everyone knows what is the allocation rule or allocation function.
Oh, right.
That's the example. So basically, in each stage, some information will be transferred between the parties. Here, the information here is this mechanism, and these are the prior distribution, and everyone knows.
So in the first stage, both the functions are fully repeated.
Yes.
Can you please repeat what's the difference between putting a realization in the interim or in the example?
I mean, partly it is because of the terminology, but I guess the way to think about the example is, hey, here's this stage in the game. Even I don't know my valuation for the item. I don't know anything. I just know that, hey, my valuation is going to be realized from some distribution. And Varun's question was, suppose at this stage you want to put an entrance. Do I want to even attend this game without knowing what my valuation is?
Isn't it better to know our value?
What is the meaning of failure? This is just a modeling assumption. But yeah, so I mean, as a buyer, if you know your value, you can make a more informative decision. But imagine that someone, so suppose, for example, in order to get to know your value, you have to do some research. And you can only do that research if you pay some fee. And then in that case, the question is, like, you're an oil company, you want to see whether you want to invest in a particular project or not. So you have to do research to make sure that, hey, here is the value of this project. But then you have the distribution knowledge about that. And maybe if someone is asking you, is it worth, doing this research and entering this game, then you're at the example stage without knowing your value, you have to make a decision. But again, so we're not going to deal with that much in this lecture. So what do we know about the buyers? I'm going to put two assumptions on the buyers, and both of them are pretty crucial. So the first one is that, well, so my buyers are quasi-linear in terms of utility. Quasi-linear utility, so what does that mean? If I look at a buyer whose valuation is V, and then the mechanism assigns an allocation X and payment P, then the utility of that buyer with valuation V for the allocation X and payment P is just the function V times X minus P. So think of X as 0, 1, so you get the valuation if you get the service equal to your value, and you pay something, your net reward is just going to be your value minus X. It might be a very natural assumption, but it's actually not that much true in many applications. It's kind of a very simplified assumption, but makes life very easy, especially in this context. And then the second one, we assume that the buyers are rational, meaning that they are trying to maximize their expected utility. And let me formalize that. So for every buyer I, and any valuation that is realized from the side of the buyer at the interim stage when she decides to bid, and for any vector b minus I, so this notation b minus I is basically the vector b1, b2, all the way to b minus I minus 1, and then bi plus 1, all the way to the end. So I'm going to use this notation several times today. So for every I, for every buyer, for every valuation, for every b minus I, the buyer is gonna buyer I beats, let's say, bi star, which is gonna be the maximizer of the expected utility of the buyer if she goes with this speed given this value. So what does that mean? Also, one thing that I should, let me actually write it down and then we'll explain. So this is going to be the argmax of essentially bi times xi of bi e minus I minus pi e minus I. And here the expectation is only over any possible randomness in the mechanism. For example, if xi is the random variable, but if you're using this other model, but xi is a number within 0 and 1, then the expectation is not needed. So this expectation really over the randomness in the mechanism, but Vi is supposed to be fixed. All right. This is the assumption. And now when you think about this in this game, each buyer basically has a strategy. So buyer I is a strategy. So what is buyers are a strategy? So from the pursuit of buyers, you get to see your value. And given your value and whatever information you have about the game, you have to decide on a number, which is your bid in this game. So that defines the function, a bidding function essentially, which so BI, you should really think of it in the as the best response that you played to basically be a mapping. So BI is basically a mapping from your valuation space, let's say R plus, all the way to R. So I'm going to use the terminology of bidding function whenever we think about buyers. Given their value, they decide on what to bid. So it's a function. Okay. Fawad, did you have a question? No?
I have.
Yes.
That's argmax part, is it? We should only consider that in equilibrium, yeah?
I'm gonna talk about that. But from imagine to you're a buyer, and you know
If we know.
the bid of the other bidders, then this is the kind of like the strategy that you have to play. Right? So there's a number that you have to do, or basically define a function. Given any BI, this is the BI star BI that you have to play. But then this semantics defines the game of incomplete information. And if you want to argue about, hey, what's happening at quote unquote some equilibrium, you need to look at the equilibrium of the game of incomplete information. And this is exactly what I'm doing. Before that, let me ask you a question. Are you guys familiar with basics of game theory, let's say Bayes-Nash equilibrium, game of incomplete information, or have you seen any kind of equilibrium notion before? If you haven't, raise your hand. So I assume that everyone has seen some notion of equilibrium. That's it. Right. So, given a mechanism, you can now think about a vector of a strategy. So basically, let me write it down. So Bayes-Nash equilibrium of this game and all right, so how is it defined? So we say that a vector of a strategy is basically a profile of different bid functions. Is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium of this game of complete information, a dash equilibrium, let's say for mechanism M, if the following holds. So for each buyer I, and any realization of the valuation for that buyer VI, then, and any deviation strategy, let's call that EI prime, the following holds. I can say, let me write it down, I'm going to explain. VI xi of EI VI, E minus I, V minus I, minus PI, EI VI, and E minus I, V minus I. When you take expectation of this thing, when V minus I is realized from the joint distribution of the other buyers, it's going to be always going to equal down the following VI xi, EI prime, E minus I, V minus I, minus I of EI prime, E minus I, V minus I. And again, here basically you're taking expectation over V minus I when they're drawn from the joint type distribution of others. And if I haven't mentioned that, we assume these values are independently drawn, which is quite important. So let me try to say how I view the Bayesian equilibrium. So we say a vector of a strategy in the Bayesian equilibrium. So that from the perspective of each buyer, given the information that she has, the best strategy is using the function PI. So now let's think about that. When the others are actually using the strategy B minus. So suppose all other buyers are using a strategy B minus. I really don't know what's the valuation of those buyers. My information in the instrument stage is that, well, so the valuation of the other buyers is drawn from their joint type distribution. Then my expected utility, given my information, is just going to be this quantity if I decide to go with the strategy BI, right? Because this is going to be my B. This would be a random variable this time. You know, if you fix the function B minus I, but because the other valuations are drawn from their type distribution, is a random vector, and this is basically how you view the rest of the world. Now you're saying if I plug this in my allocation function and the others are plugging this random vector in their allocation function, and the same about the payment, then the expected utility I get, where the randomness is really in the valuation or private types of the other buyers, my expected utility is going to be maximized if I pick this quantity. If I pick any other deviation bit, my expected utility should only go down. Yes?
The expectation is also on the randomness on the.
Yeah, so if there is randomness in the mechanism, you're also considering that. Having said that, you can think about notions of equilibrium in which you want to have best response pointwise. Like if there is a randomness in the mechanism, you want, no matter what coins of the mechanism are realized, you still are in a Bayesian equilibrium, then you're not allowed to take the expectation, but you also can define the equilibrium expectation, which is, so the pointwise one is a stronger guarantee.
Oh.
Yes.
So why is this is strictly stronger than an equilibrium where the randomness was also over BI? Why did we like?
Because
at any point of time, whenever I draw my value, I should be certain that I'm doing the right thing.
Right, because of the sequence of events here, right? So you get to see your value first, and then you decide on how to do it. For example, if I replace these two, then it's going to be similar to the setting that Varun mentioned, which is at the example stage, you have to give your read. That's a different game of incomplete information, and then you get a different answer here. But in this standard Bayesian mechanism design setting, after a buyer gets to see her value, he's going to be asked to report this. Right? Is it clear why this notion makes sense? Right? So now, I'm gonna make some simplifications of this setting, and then we will start thinking about designing mechanisms. So the first thing I'm going to do is the following. So you can restrict your attention to a special class of mechanisms. I'm going to call them direct mechanisms. Direct mechanisms. So what's a direct mechanism? It's basically the same protocol, but in this stage, in this step, you ask the buyers to report their valuations. You basically restrict your space of peace to exactly be the same as the space of valuations, and you ask the buyers to report their values. The direct mechanism is going to be basically mechanism in which you ask the buyers to report their values. Okay. Let's keep it informal. Now, here's a very strong theorem called revelation principle. So it basically says that if you restrict your attention to the class of direct mechanisms, this is without loss. Meaning that if you pick for any given, for any mechanism M and a vector B that is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium for this mechanism M. So I pick a pair, a mechanism and its corresponding Bayes-Nash equilibrium, then there exists a direct mechanism M prime that is essentially strategically equivalent to M. That is strategically equivalent to M. And here, the vector B of X to be equal to X is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium. So let's think about this. So what it says that, hey, suppose you have a mechanism and there's a Bayes-Nash equilibrium that mechanism, like for example, I'm running, I don't know, first price auction. Given your value, you're going to bid something, you definitely are not going to bid your own value because you know I'm going to charge you with your bid. So in order to make any utility, you are better off bidding something lower. The game has a Bayes-Nash equilibrium. Now, given this pair, we can always come up with a new mechanism that at the first step is asking the buyers to report their values. And this mechanism is what I call a Bayesian incentive compatible mechanism, or BIC, which means that first of all, it's a direct mechanism. Second, truthful reporting your own value is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium in this direct mechanism. It is equivalent to the original one in the sense that basically for any value that is realized in the first game, if you look at the outcome in that game and compare it with the outcome in the second game, you have exactly the same distribution for both the allocation and the payment. Okay, so let me show you why this is called by a picture, like a proof using picture, and then you will see that this is nothing but just using a different notation. It's really not a deep theorem, although it has deep consequences. Yes.
And I don't understand what's the meaning of direct mechanism, because if they are allowed to lie, so what's the difference between beating and telling the lie?
It's not, so basically, well, so if for example, imagine that the space of the bits is different from the space of the values, then there will be a huge difference between a direct mechanism and an indirect mechanism. Like for example, you can beat whether you want to go left or right. Given your value, you want to decide whether you want to go left or right. So you really don't report your value, just report your action. And even in that setting, you can define a Bayesian game of incomplete information and a Bayesian equilibrium. But then there will be a direct counterpart in which in the first step, I'm not going to receive the left and right from the agents. I'm going to ask them for their values. And then I'm going to decide on the allocation of the values. So the space of bits might be very different from the space of original values. But the direct mechanism leads to a space match. And the interpretation is that you're really reporting on your own value. Yes.
Also, like first price auctions are not direct, right?
It is indirect, right? It is an example in which the interpretation of your bid is not your value. It's just a number, and the auctioneer is treating that in some way, right? Let me explain the revelation principle, and then you will see for a second, in a second that why we are actually doing this trick. So suppose I have a bunch of buyers. They are strategic and quasi-linear as always. And in the interim stage, each buyer observes her value, V1, V2, V3, all the way to V. Okay. And then we have this mechanism M, the indirect mechanism, which receives the bid from these buyers. So each buyer has a box in front of her, the B1 function, B2 function, all the way to the N function. And suppose these functions, these mappings, are actually B and E corresponding to this mechanism. So then you can think of each buyer as basically putting her value into this box and reporting a number, which is B1, V1 here. This guy is going to report B2, V2, and this guy is going to report Bn, Vn. And what do we know about these numbers? So we know that if you basically hide the words except for one buyer, and you look at that buyer, then the expected utility of buyer given the valuation V1 is going to maximize if she plugs the number V1 into the mechanism, right? That's what we know because this is a big B and E. So now let's do the following. So let's say I want to define a direct mechanism. Here is the mechanism I define. Basically this point. This is going to be my, oh, by the way, so this mechanism is going to return the allocations, the payments. Okay. So now this is the new mechanism I'm defining. So M prime. So how does M prime work? At stage one, I ask the buyers to report their values. I know the Bayesian equilibrium vector, so I'm gonna apply that vector, basically each function on the received values, and then I'm gonna plug them into M, see what will be the allocation and payment. I'm gonna use that allocation. So M prime now is a direct mechanism because first I say I ask everyone, hey, report your value. They might lie about it, but they're gonna give me some number. Then I'm gonna give those numbers as the mechanism. I'm gonna give those numbers to these boxes, create the bit vector, give it to M, find the allocation there. Now claim, if this is a B and E, then M prime is gonna be a BIC mechanism, meaning that no one has any incentives to misreport her valuation to this mechanism. Why is that? Because, well, I'm basically saying that reporting V one prime is dominated by reporting V1. And when I say dominated, which means that the expected utility you get under V1 prime report is smaller than V1 in the mechanism M prime. Because now I can also use the fact that reporting B1 prime equal to B1 of B1 prime is dominated by reporting B1. So basically what I'm saying is if someone whose valuation is V1, rather than reporting V1 goes with V1 prime, then this is equivalent to, in the first case, the person goes with a deviation B equal to B1 prime, which is B1 of V1 prime. And we already know that the utility you get under this is smaller than B1 V1 because of the fact that B is a Bayesian equilibrium. So that means reporting V1 gives you weakly more expected utility than reporting V1. Is it clear? So simple like this.
And what we proved is that the truthful values are one of many possible equilibrium.
Yes, but note the following, right? So in this revelation principle, I'm actually fixing a particular Bayesian equilibrium. So it's not that, hey, I have a mechanism M and here is the direct revelation.
No, fixing the B, but now there can be another setting of V's that is also
Sure.
an equilibrium for M.
I just know that the truthfulness is one of the PHs. Okay. So now this is the space that we are going to search over in order to find good mechanisms. And let me introduce a few more notations that again make life simpler. So from now on, you're only thinking about direct mechanisms. And every time that you have an indirect mechanism, something that's not direct is called indirect, you apply a revelation principle and look at its strategic equivalent mechanism and work with that. So from now on, we only have direct mechanisms in this lecture. And then we define the allocation function and the payment function, which are mappings from the vector of bits to allocation and payment one for each player. Similarly, we can define what are called allocation rule and a payment rule. For a direct mechanism, allocation rule and payment rule. It's kind of the same concept, but the input to the function this time is going to be essentially the reported valuation. And I'm going to use B because we're going to work with incentive compatible mechanisms. So the notation here is a little bit confusing. Don't get confused. It's going to become more clear when I write the condition for PIC. For now, think about allocation rule as a mapping that in a direct mechanism maps the vector of values or reported values. And imagine in your head that they are the same for now, to numbers between 0 and 1. And payment rule is a mapping from values, not the bits, to real numbers. And for now, in this part of the lecture, imagine that the values and the bits are the same. Basically, everyone is reporting truthfully. Yes.
So this revelation principle seems way more general, right? Like non-quasi-linear utilities, not even necessarily allocation and payment have to come out. Even it
doesn't need to be a mechanism problem. It can be a contract problem. It can be a Bayesian persuasion problem.
Right. I could have multiple things beside values.
Yeah. You can see revelation principles in all different corners of macroeconomics. Exactly. But it's not universally true. There are also examples in which revelation principle breaks. I can mention to you some of those after the point. All right. So now describing a mechanism using the allocation of payment rule, the way that we want to think about the IC constraint is that, well, so what kind of restrictions should I put on these two functions so that reporting truthfully would be a Bayes-Nash equilibrium of the mechanism defined by this allocation rule. But this is the question we try to add. So let me write it down. So how can XIPI be truthful or be Bayesian incentive compatible? And now literally we're gonna write down conditions that need to be satisfied by these two mappings so that you have the Bayesian incentive compatibility. And let's do that. I'm going to define again this utility function. So UI is basically equal to, let's say, UI of Vi and some deviation valuation V prime is equal to Vi times Xi of Vi and V minus I. And here, in these calculations, let me, actually, you know what, let me do something that makes life even simpler. So given this allocation of payment rule, I'm going to also define two other objects in interim allocation rule and interim payment rule. So how are they defined? So given these two functions, xi, where the input is the entire valuation profile, and pi, where the input again is the entire valuation profile, I'm defining xi of vi, and again, I'm using a notation. So this is the same notation, but these are really two different functions. The input argument of this function is an n-dimensional vector. Here is just a single number. So xi vi is nothing but just the expectation of xi v condition on vi. Basically, I'm in other language that they have been using in this course. So expectation of xi vi v minus I, and I'm taking only expectation over v minus I drawn from minus I. It's the same. And for the payment rule, pi vi is defined to be the expectation of this payment function, payment rule, the function condition on vi. Again, this is basically the expectation of pi v minus I when v minus I is drawn from s minus I and vi is treated as a deterministic vector. Okay. Yes.
By xi and pi being BIC, you mean there exists an equilibrium BIC, or the only equilibrium should be BIC?
I want to put conditions on this so that BIC is an equilibrium. Basically, truthful reporting is a very fashion.
So who is gonna force that equilibrium to happen? If
We are going to assume that equilibrium is happening. If there are multiple equilibria, this is actually a challenge in game theory. That's, hey, how can I force myself to be in one of these equilibria? There are equilibrium refinements that they try to actually make the equilibrium unique. We are not doing any of those here. If truthful reporting is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium, I'm just going to assume the game is going to be played at that. But you're absolutely right that if there are multiple equilibria, then you either need to change your equilibrium concept to be unique, or maybe perturb the game, change the rules of the game so that it becomes unique. I'm not going to do any of this. So, yes.
I think I'm confused, but based on what you wrote there, if something is not incentive compatible, so B1 wasn't the best response.
No, but M might have multiple Bayes-Nash equilibria. So I agree with you that if this game has a unique Bayes-Nash equilibrium, then the unique equilibrium of M prime is going to be truthful reporting. But this game might have different equilibria. Like for example, imagine it has two equilibria, B1 and B2. Then I can actually design, so if you use B1 for revelation principle, then B2 composition with B1 inverse is also going to be an equilibrium. Right? So basically I cancel the effect of B1 first using B1 inverse, and then I apply B2.
I see.
So basically the uniqueness of equilibria here is an artifact of the uniqueness of the Bayesian equilibrium for this game of incomplete function. If this one has multiple equilibria, then something rather than truthful reporting is going to be. Right? These are great questions. So why did I define these things? If you remember from the definition of Bayesian equilibrium, when you are calculating utilities, you are taking expectation over the randomness in the evaluations of other values. And everything is quasi-linear. All these utilities, they have the linear form. So therefore, I can actually write down a reduced form version of the truthful condition. And let me try to do that here, and then you will see why these objects are important. So I'm defining the interim utility of an agent. This is the value, the original valuation of the agent, and this is the deviation. So this is equal to vi times this time xi of vi, the interim allocation, minus the interim payment, but at the point b prime. So I'm assuming that the agent's value is vi. In the interim stage, even though the agent value is vi, it's going to report v prime. Therefore, this is going to be the interim allocation that the agent gets. And then it's going to pay the interim payment pi of v prime. Okay? I basically move the expectation inside this function to have what is called a uniform, the reduced form, or interim allocation. All right, so now here's the alternative definition of BIC. So BIC is equivalent to saying that basically VI belongs to a set of maximizers of the interim utility function when we use VI here. So I'm maximizing over all possible V primes. This utility, so VI appears twice. It is here and also here. So if you assume the value of the agent is VI, then the agent's utility, interim utility, is going to be maximized if she decides to beat VI. Does it make sense?
So the deviation is for this agent only.
Right. So again, I'm thinking about the interim functions. So in some sense, I'm assuming that, very good question. So basically, the way to think about BIC is the function. So imagine all other agents are being truth. They're playing the Bayesian equilibrium strategy, which in this direct mechanism is basically truthfulness. Because they are getting truthfully, and you know that their valuations are realized from their type, then you basically, when you take expectation over their values and you look at their bits, it's similar to plugging V minus I. Here, I'm assuming that V minus I is realized from that minus I. Okay, so that part is taken care of in this interim allocation and payment function. Now, if this holds for every I, so basically if for every I, this holds, then we basically have the BIC condition for all the agents. Maybe I should have unpacked this and it would have been more clear. So basically, you want to say, back to the original formula, you want to say VI XI VI B minus I minus, let's say, PI, make this B prime B minus I. So we're going to say that VI is actually and argmax of expected utility, where essentially P minus I here is realized from F minus I. And why is that? Because, well, so I'm looking at the truthful report as a strategy, and the other valuations are drawn from the joint distribution. So these numbers are essentially V minus X. And this is going to be your interim utility. And you want to say that, well, so among all the possible deviations, the one that is most profitable is reporting my own value. Yes?
Basically, if everyone else tells the truth, if you lie, you can't do it better.
Correct. However, you don't know the truthful report of the others. You just know that the truthful report of the others is going to be equal to their values, and their values are realized from some common prior distribution. Therefore, your understanding of your utility is the expectation over that random. Is the expected utility over that random.
Yeah.
So you don't know what's happening in the world. You just know that everyone is reporting truthful. And because you know the underlying distribution of their values, you know that the bit vector of the others is going to be realized from their joint distribution.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that if everyone else tells the truth, I can't do anything better than me telling the truth.
Correct. But to assess, what I'm saying is, in order to assess that, you have to take expectation over the random in the type of. Yeah. All right. So this is algebraically the condition that you need. And now, as someone who knows optimization, when I tell you, hey, maximization of this function is happening in this point, then you start writing first order condition or second order condition. This is exactly what we're gonna do here. There are many ways to get the results I'm trying to get to. This is maybe the most direct and the least interesting way of doing it, but in some ways it's the fastest. So I'm looking at that function, ui of vi and v prime. And so we're saying vi is one of the maximizers of ui, vi and v prime. And what is this function? So this is vi times xi of v prime minus pi of v prime. And for now, assume that you're thinking about mechanisms where the allocation rule, payment rules, they are all differentiable. These are for simplicity. There are ways to get rid of all of these simplifications, but for now, assume that these functions, they have first order and second order derivatives. Just make life easy. Now I can say, well, so the first order partial of ui with respect to its actual argument v prime at v prime equal to vi should be equal to 0, right? So what does this imply? So this implies that, well, so vi xi prime of v prime, this is the first partial, at point v prime equal to vi, minus pi prime of v prime at v prime equal to vi is equal to 0. And that basically means that pi of vi, and by the way, this should hold for everything, right? So for every vi, pi prime of vi is equal to vi xi prime of vi. And then I can write down actually what the function, what this function is as the allocation function. So pi of v minus pi of 0 should be equal to the integral from 0 to v of, let's say, t xi prime of t dt. And as simple as it is actually very important and has interesting implications. So the first thing it says is that if you have a pair of allocation of payments, and somehow you know that this allocation of payments, these direct allocation payment rules are BIC, then given the allocation, you can uniquely find payments. The payment is going to be uniquely characterizable as long as you fix the application. But then one might say, well, Rod, so you just showed us the first order condition. You have to actually check the second order condition. Maybe this is actually a minimizer, not a maximizer. How would you ensure that? Okay, so let me call this the first condition. So the second condition is the second, basically the second order condition for this problem. So I'm going to look at the second order partial of UI with respect to V prime. What that would be? So this is my original function. All right, so it's going to be basically equal to VI XI double prime V prime minus PI double prime V prime. I'm assuming that even second order partials exist, just again for simplicity. And then we know that PI is equal to this thing, right? Or PI prime is equal to this thing. So what would be PI double prime? So PI double prime is going to be, let's do the differentiation. It's going to be VI XI double prime, sorry, basically V, right? Because you're looking at this function at the point V prime. So it's going to be V prime XI double prime V prime plus XI prime at the point V prime. I just use this identity in order to find it. Yes.
Do you assume that P is linear or?
No. Oh, this is the first order partial, right? So then if this is, then this is how the integral is related to, right? So integral from 0 to V of the first order partial of a function is going to be the function of the last point minus the function of the first point.
Isn't it multiplied by 0 for the xi prime 0? Am I missing something?
So let me write it down. So the first order partial of PI, let's say rho PI or rho T, is equal to T times xi prime of T. That's what we know about this function. Therefore, if I take the integral from both hand sides from 0 to V, this becomes PID minus PI0, and this is going to be this right. That's all I'm saying. Make sense?
Oh.
Okay. So now, okay, so this is the second order partial, and I'm gonna look at the curvature of this function at the point VI. So what would be the second partial at the point V prime equal to VI?
Minus xi prime V.
It's gonna be minus xi prime VI. And then if this quantity is negative, that means you basically have a maximum. Or in other words, if your allocation function is monotone, xi prime vi is greater or equal than 0, then it satisfies condition 2. This is brilliant. So what it says is the following. It says that, hey, if you are thinking about the space of BIC mechanisms, you don't need to really be worried about allocation payment. You can just give me an allocation rule that satisfies this condition. So any interim allocation rule that is monotone increasing definitely satisfies this condition. And then from this integral, we can find the corresponding payment rule, and then the combination of them is going to be a PIC mechanism. So the optimization problem over the space of PIC mechanism is really the optimization problem over the space of monotone function, one for each pair. Does it make sense? All right, so let's get some more interesting insights from these things. So first one is the geometric interpretation of payments or payment rule. So assume, so we always assume in this lecture that the payment for lowest types, PI is zero. So if someone has value 0 or report 0, you are not going to charge that person with any money. Now you can say PI of V is equal to the integral from 0 to V T xi prime t dt. Now I'm going to use integration by parts. So u dv is going to be uv, so t xit from 0 to v minus v du, integral from 0 to v of xi t dt, which is equal to v xi v minus integral from 0 to v of xi t dt. And this one has a nice geometric interpretation. So we know BIC allocation function, interim allocation function, like this one. They should be monotone. Let's say something like this. When I look at a particular valuation, the report equal to V, then you can say this payment is equal to V, so this is xiv, xiv. So this is V times xiv minus the integral, which is the area under the curve. So this is basically this one. So this is going to be the payment. That's the geometric interpretation. And now you can say something about it. So suppose I commit to a mechanism that has an allocation rule and a payment rule that satisfies the payment identity here. And this thing is, by the way, called payment identity. Payment identity. Sometimes it goes by the name of interim payment equivalence, in the sense that if you have two different mechanisms with the same interim allocation rule, then they're going to have the same interim payment. If you saw the word payment equivalence, this is basically a fancy way of saying the payment identity equation. And it means that if you have two mechanisms that have the same interim allocation rule, maybe they have different allocation rules in the exposed setting, but they have the same interim allocation rule, then definitely they will have the same interim payment because of the payment identity. Okay, so now suppose I have this allocation of payment rule that satisfy the payment identity. Now I'm asking the following question: what is the expected revenue that you can get from this mechanism? Or in particular, if I look at either I, what's the expected payment that the bidder is paying in this mechanism, where this time expectation is over all the randomness in the world, including the private valuation of the agent. So expected revenue. I'm looking at expectation, let's say PI. This time I'm taking expectation of VI itself. Then this is going to be equal to the integral from 0 to infinity this is for vi. Fi of, let's say, v. And then let's use that function. It goes as well. So let's use that function. All right, so I'm gonna have v xi of v minus the integral from 0 to v xi t dt, and then dv. So this integral has two parts. One part from this term, one part from this term. Let's look at the second part. So integral from 0 to infinity of fi v multiplied by the integral from 0 to v of xi t dt. So every time that you see two integrals, the first thing to try is swapping their order. I'm going to look at this integral over v, this is integral over t. I'm going to look at the integral t from 0 to infinity, xit, and then integral from v, starting from t to infinity. When you swap the order of the integrals, and now you're going to have fi v dv, and then you have dt. Now things will start getting simpler. So this is going to be 1 minus CDF at point t. Now I'm writing it down in kind of interesting form. So it's going to be integral t from 0 to infinity. I'm multiplying the fi of t and dividing by the same thing. It's going to be fit xit multiplied by 1 minus fit divided by fit dt. Last, so I'm just renaming t to be v. There's a number. So this is going to be the integral v from 0 to infinity, fiv xiv and 1 minus fi of v divided by fiv. All right. Now, given this calculation, we can say the expectation of PIV is in fact equal to the expectation of. So the first term is expectation of Vxi. The second one is the expectation of this thing times xi, where these expectations are over drawn from the PDF file. It's going to be expectation of vi minus 1 minus fi vi divided by little fi vi times xi vi when vi is realized from fi. Just merged this term with this term, and this is going to be final call. Now you see this function here. Let me focus on that. This is called milestone virtual value function.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Here, what actually in the previous one, what we have proved is that no matter how that general xi and pi, which was depending on the whole vector values, no matter how we choose those, if the new xi, which was expected of that previous xi over conditional only vi, if that remains the same, then our revenue is remaining the same.
Yes. Yes. The expected revenue only depends on the in-stream allocation. That's your question. So if I give you the sequence of interim allocation with one for everyone, then you can give me a number for expected revenue, no matter how those allocation rules have been reduced to those interim rules. Yeah. Any other questions? I don't know if you find this fascinating, but it's very simple, but at the same time quite deep. So Myers-Briggs virtual value function. So given a distribution, virtual valuation function phi of v is defined to be basically v minus 1 minus CDF divided by PDF. So just a definition. So we say distribution is regular definition. So we say Fi is a regular distribution. If phi of v is a monotone increasing function. And in a second, you will see why this is quite important. It should be actually monotone non-decrease, weakly increase. Now, this is the one lemma that you have to go to Roger Myerson's office and tell him that you just learned. Myerson's lemma is the one thing that we prove. Give me any interim allocation rule or set of interim allocation rules that are PIC. Given any PIC interim allocation rule, and when I say given any BIC interim allocation, this is the fancy way of saying engineering a sequence of monotone increasing functions, because you already know in single parameter mechanism design, BIC allocations are those that monotone increasing. That's the only requirement. So given any BIC interim allocation rule, xi v I from 1 to n, one expected payment of everyone. Let's say expected PI v is equal to what I call the expected allocated virtual value to this person. So expectation of PI v times xiv. Here the expectation is over distribution of where I. I think a nice way to think about this is really like when you think about revenue, you have to replace values v with another quantity called virtual value. Now allocated value becomes allocated virtual value. Allocated value is what we call social welfare. Allocated virtual value for BIC mechanism is really the expected revenue. It's the money that you collect. And that's the beauty of this result, that basically reduces the revenue maximization problem for basically optimizing over the class of mechanisms in order to find the one that maximizes expected revenue to the simpler question of maximizing social welfare. You just need to change the values to virtual values and everything will essentially be the same. So this is the first thing, and then expected revenue which is the expectation of the summation of these variances. Yep. So each expectation gets this expectation over all the values. Right? So this is basically equal to sum y from 1 to the version. It's going to be the expectation of summation I from 1 to n xi vi times vi vi. Here the expectation is over all these values that are drawn from the type distribution. Okay. Now let's try to design the BIC mechanism that maximizes revenue, especially when the distributions are regular. Marson's optimal mechanism. And for now, let's think about the single item. When you have one item to sell, there are n buyers, each one has a valuation per item. The space of feasible allocations are all the vector 0 ones that only have 1 1 and the rest are 0. So now what would be the Marson's optimal mechanism? Any suggestion? Second price auction. Okay, so that's one solution. What else? So we want to maximize this quantity. So do you have different buyers? So suppose you want to maximize the valuations. To maximize social or sum of the value or the value of the person who buys the item. What would you do?
You give it all to the person with most expected value.
Right? So first of all, rule number 1 in Bayesian, with a single parameter Bayesian mechanism design, don't think about the payment stream. Because you know from the payment identity that as long as you have monotone allocation, there is a way to find the payment. I don't care how at this point, but I know there is a way, right? So then you only need to think about the allocation. Now I'm asking you, your objective function is to maximize welfare, the summation of vi xi. Okay, so here's this trivial mechanism. I ask everyone to report their values. I give the item to the one with the highest value. And there is a payment rule that makes this incentive compatible. I don't know what that is. It's actually second price action, which is charging with the second highest bid. And it comes out of the payment identity automatically. I'm not going to show you, but this is a good exercise. But you know, we know, well, also because of payment identity, it is monotone. So this should be the one that maximizes social value. Now, if you ask the same question about revenue, and you know the payment identity and the payment equivalence, then what should you do? It's the same thing, right? So I just need to replace the values with the neutral value. So here is the mechanism. Ask buyers to report their values VI. Give the item to I hat, who is the one that maximizes the virtual value. So you know these functions, right? So given the distribution, you can compute these functions. You can plug these numbers into this function and see who is the one that has the maximum virtual value. However, you should only give it to this guy only if vi hat of vi hat, the winner of this competition, is greater or equal than 0. The one thing about virtual valuation function is that they might be actually negative. And here, if for example you are maximizing this function and all these virtual values are negative, you are better off allocating nothing. If only if this, otherwise allocate to no one. And this might come out of kind of a surprise. Because you're like, wow, so there are certain times that I have the item, I decide to not sell the item, and still this mechanism is maximizing revenue. What's happening? And even though it is counterintuitive, if you deeply think about it, it's not that much counterintuitive. What's happening is that you are maximizing your expected revenue, not really point-wise revenue. So you, among all the sample paths of value, so on average, you want to maximize your revenue. And then you want to have truthfulness also on average. So sometimes you're better off for the sake of truthfulness actually allocating to no one. And that gives you an opportunity to extract revenue in some other sample paths. And this is basically why the expected revenue is eventually maximized, even though under some certain sample paths where all the visual values are negative, you decide to allocate to no one.
They can select second with reserve, second price with reserve.
Correct. Like for example, yeah, so thinking about the symmetric setting, when all the distributions are the same, and let's say all the distributions are regular, meaning that the virtual value is monotone. So you ask everyone to record their values. You apply the virtual value, and then you pick the maximum one. Because the virtual value functions are monotone, they don't change the ordering of the values. So that means the candidate's winner is the guy with the maximum value. But upon a condition, and that's where, if the virtual value of that person is larger than 0. And the virtual value is this monotone increasing function, there is a threshold after that is going to be non-negative, that's called monopoly reserve of distribution, where the virtual value is exactly equal to 0. And now the optimal action is the following. I run a second price auction, but with a reserve price equal to the point that the virtual value is equal to. So you basically, you want to give to the highest bidder only if the highest bidder value is above a certain threshold, the monopoly reserve. And that is the one that is maximally discounted. Yes, ma'am.
Can you please repeat why that one is maximizing?
Yeah. Just think about it.
Because
I haven't even proved that this is incentive compatible or anything. It just like seems to be the optimal option.
because we should convert this original x to interim x's.
Yeah, let's do that, right? So basically, this is a general rule, right? It's not the reduced form. So imagine you want to maximize, right? And now you really think of this as well. So if I replace the reduced form with the actual allocation rule, this is essentially like the same objective, but I have brought the expectation inside. Expectation with respect to v minus I inside the summation. So if I have the option of not only maximizing this expectation, but actually point-wise maximizing it, this is going to be the best thing I can do. So what I'm claiming is that here you really try to not maximize this expectation. Actually try to maximize this summation point-wise.
Not that summation, when we replace it with general x.
Right. So this is equal to that general thing we're talking about. So this is equal to the expectation over v from I from 1 to n xi v this time, VIV, because of the independence of the values. This expectation is equal to that expectation. Here, when you bring in this inside, right? So you first take expectation with respect to v minus I, then this allocation rule becomes interim allocation rule first, and then you have the rest. This is equal to that. And now I'm targeting to maximize this quantity. So I try to actually maximize it pointwise. For any vector evaluation, I set xi to be 1 for the one that has maximum PIVI, only if the PIVI of that guy is non-negative. Otherwise, I'm going to set the xi to be 0. But this is definitely maximizing that objective. The part I didn't show is that from this allocation rule, if you find the corresponding interim allocation rule, it's going to be monotone increasing. Because if it is, then because of the payment identity, you have a PI symmetry. So why the above allocation rule is increasing? That's the question. And it has something to do with that regularity assumption. In fact, imagine I'm buyer I, and there is certain probability that I win this auction. If my value goes up, and my virtual value is not increasing, then my score in this auction, which is my virtual value, is gonna weakly increase. And hence my probability of winning the auction is gonna increase. Does it make sense? So as a buyer that attends this auction, the only score that is relevant to your allocation is your virtual value, right? Because everyone reports their value, the value becomes virtual value. Then the auction looks at the virtual value, picks the one that has the maximum virtual value, and that's going to be the winner if the virtual value is non-negative. So if you're a buyer and somehow your virtual value increases, then your probability of winning the auction is going to increase or weakly increase. And this is exactly what you have to answer when you think about monitoring. So why xi star, let's say vi is increasing? Because of the regularity. In fact, what's happening is that if vi increases, then phi of vi increases. And therefore, the probability that you allocate to I is going to only increase. Does it make sense? So suppose I want to give the item to the highest valuation. If the value of someone goes up, then that person is going to win the auction with higher probability. Now I'm just replacing values with virtual value. But then if I don't have the regularity condition, there is no guarantee that your virtual value goes up if your value goes up. With the multiplicity condition, your value goes up, virtual value goes up. Therefore, your actual score in the auction goes up. And therefore, your probability of getting the item. Yes.
How restrictive is this regularity condition on F5?
Great question. It's actually not restrictive at all. There is a, but I mean, not in a very trivial way. So, is the replacement to this virtual value? I'm not defining it, but let me give you some pointers. So the keyword to search for is iRand virtual value. The idea is if I have a virtual value function and then there are certain intervals where it is decreasing, I can imagine that the virtual value does not change. And then if I guarantee my allocation function in those intervals has first order derivative equal to 0 because I erase that. So because of the payment identity, if you guarantee that in intervals in which virtualization function is decreasing, your first order derivative is 0 on the side of the allocation function, then everything goes through and payment identity goes through, and payment equivalence goes through, and milestones level goes through. You can just like replace the value with that virtual valuation function. So what I'm trying to say is that if it is not regular, there is this operation at the virtual value, which gives you another monotone increasing function called iron virtual value. But now that you're designing your auction, there is an extra restriction on the allocation. Not only it should be monotone, but also in intervals that you iron the virtual value, you made it flat, the allocation function should not change. And it turns out that you can again run the same recipe, and the allocation that you get has that property. Basically, the optimal marathon auction for irregular distributions is almost the same thing. You give the item to the guy with the maximum virtual value, but sometimes there are some number of people that their maximum virtual value is equal to each other. In those sequences, in those situations, you have to actually randomize between all the buyers and give item to one of them in uniform legend. It turns out that this would be the optimal mechanism. So one interesting consequence of that is that if the distributions are regular, optimal mechanism does not need any randomness. The optimal deterministic mechanism, optimal randomized mechanisms are this. But then if you are in the world of irregular distributions, the optimal mechanism, because of the fact that an iron interval should be flat, is to randomize between everyone that has the maximum iron virtual value, and randomness is required in something. but it's beyond the scope of this.
You don't need to do this type breaking. If I is regular distribution.
Not really. I mean, basically, if the distributions are continuous enough, then that event is going to measure your area.
Okay, great.
Right. So because it's gonna be like a more than a strictly increasing function. But then for eigenmutual values, there is actually non-measured zero intervals in which you're doing the ironing, and therefore that event can happen. Yes.
We need that p function to be strictly increasing. Well, that's
For simplicity, I assume it is strictly increasing, but even if it is weakly increasing and there is a tie, you can just give to one person arbitrarily. It doesn't matter to whom. Right, but when you use the eigenmutual values, you don't have the payment equivalence as you have here. It's a kind of under a condition payment equivalence holds. This is why you need to do type breaking. But here, either assume that the initial value is strictly increasing and therefore there will be no ties, as long as distributions are continuous enough. Or if there is a tie, just break the tie arbitrarily. It doesn't matter. Give the item to someone that has the maximum ratio. Yes.
Sorry. My second point is the x function should be strictly increasing or
No, it should be weakly increasing.
The allocation function is weakly increasing because my thought is if someone is willing to pay 300 because they like it 300,
Yeah.
and I am willing to pay 5, if I'm suddenly willing to pay 6, I'm still not getting the item.
Well, I mean, if the virtual value becomes flat, then even though your value increases, your virtual value does not increase.
No.
Therefore, there is no need that xi increases in a strict fashion.
But didn't we need xi to be strict because of the concavity?
No, we just needed the second order partial to be to not be positive. It can be flat, it doesn't matter. It can be flat around the max. I don't care.
So this allocation rule, the allocation rule you get from here is of course not differentiable and doubly differentiable. It's like a argmax kind of thing. But there must
It
be
is
some
actually differentiable. As a function of v, it is differentiable. So the reduced form is differential.
Yeah. You haven't
I mean, what is the actual allocation, right? So if phi vi is greater than max of p minus iv minus I, then you're going to get the item.
right.
But then the probability of this event as a function of vi is going to be a pretty continuous function.
All right. These FIs are all assumed.
Yeah, the interior allocation rules are continuous enough, but not the actual allocation. And by the way, I didn't tell you how much to charge this agent. So you give the item to this agent, you can't let him go. You have to charge the agent with some money. Let's not talk about that, but the payment comes from the payment identity. So you have to write down the allocation function here, and then that will give you the payment function. Let me not do that. So how about taking a break maybe for, let's say, 5 minutes, and then we will be back 10 minutes, and then we can continue with sequential phase. And use some of these techniques.
Is there a way to get the exposed payment rule?
Yeah. In fact, there is a version of the payment identity. There is a version of the, so we can replace the BIC condition with the DSIC condition and do exactly the same thing, assuming that you know the bids of the other buyers. And then from that, we can get a version of the payment identity, which is kind of like a point-wise version. And from that, you can get the exposed allocation. But you know, like, the funny part is, at the end of the day, what matters for you is the interim allocation. So from the interim, here we actually have an exposed allocation. that gives, and then from the ex post allocation rule, that is the right one, we can find the interim allocation rule. And you know, any payment rule that gives you the interim payment rule would work. So here's one way of doing it. Just ask everyone to report how much they are willing to pay, their valuation, then charge them with the interim payments, no other ones. It's not going to be IR.
It's exposed IR.
It's not going to be exposed IR. It's going to be interim IR. It's not going to be exposed IR.
But that's easy to do exposed IR. You can just divide by the probability of allocation.
Right. If you divide by the probability of allocation, then it becomes exposed IR in expectation. But then there is also a way of making the points-wise exposed IR, not only in expectation. That only comes from writing the payment identity and the equilibrium condition of the DSIC. So this actually, whether it is BIC or we design it to be BIC, it turns out to be actually DSIC. Dominant strategy incentive.
Did you assign a scriber this class?
Oh no. Oh.
I just like I did by time. Why is no one else?
So you need more conditions for DSIC, right? Some ontoness or something. I'm wondering there's something else. Like when you're looking at indirect mechanisms.
Conditions on what?
So when you look at the indirect version of the mechanism, you need to make like the value space and the bit space the same, and some subjectivity of some function is required. It's not DSIC by. What are you saying? It's DSIC by default.
So one thing. Right. So let me tell you one more thing, and then we will have a little bit of investigation about pricing mechanisms. So I'm gonna define a transformation. We're gonna use it in this lecture and also in the next lecture. It's called quantile mapping. Quite easy, but turns out to be pretty helpful. So imagine I have a distribution F. Now, pick, let's say, a quantile or probability that is number between 0 and 1. So then I can define a mapping. I call it the value mapping, V of Q, which is basically equal to inverse of the CDF, and imagine the CDF is invertible. So inverse of CDF at the point 1 minus Q. Or equivalently, this is going to be basically the threshold such that the probability that a random variable realized from this distribution, let's say X, being greater than the threshold is exactly equal to Q. Okay. That's one quantity. I'm going to define one other thing called posted price revenue function. Posted price revenue function. So what is this defined? So R of Q, the posted price revenue function, is basically equal to Q times V of Q. So the way to think about it is, suppose I'm selling the item to a particular agent whose valuation is coming from this distribution F. And I want to set a price so that the prompted the price gets accepted is equal to Q. Then the revenue that I get from that sale is going to be equal to Q times the price that has the acceptance property of Q, which is V of Q, so Q times V of Q is going to be this function. Okay. Now, here's a funny thought experiment. Suppose I'm thinking about the pricing mechanism, so I'm posting a price V of Q, and then I look at the agent, so the agent is going to accept the price if the value is above the price, is going to reject if the value is smaller than the price. If I think about the allocation function that I get from this simple pricing mechanism, what that allocation function would be? So basically what I'm saying is, fix a quantile Q, fix Q, set price V of Q,
B greater than or equal to V of.
yeah. So X of V, if V is smaller than V of Q, is going to be 0, right? And then after it's going to be equal to 1. All right, that's good. The second question. Given the definition of the virtual value and everything, what will be the expected payment from this allocation with my allocation? Right, so imagine now, again, so we're designing a mechanism. So the allocation comes from pricing, which is this function. So there is a threshold V of Q. If the value is greater than that, you want to sell. If it is smaller, you don't want to sell. Now we also know from the payment identity that if you have any monotone increasing allocation function, there is a way to make it incentive compatible. Then what would be the payment rule of that thing? Simply like charging the V of Q, right? Okay, that's good. One other question. What is the expected payments? Okay. And now we are going to use Morrison. So the expected payment, which by the way we know it is equal to this one. This is price imposed. Is going to be equal to the expectation of your allocation function, let's say X of V, and the virtual valuation function. Right? So that's how can we see what I want? So basically, right, so yeah, I'm trying to show that the first order partial of rho with respect to Q would be actually equal to phi of V of Q. Yeah, so let me not show that I can't recall the exact proof. But somehow this is correct. Should come out of this. But trust me that this lemma, I'm going to show you the proof later, maybe send you an email with the proof. So this lemma is that, well, so if you look at this revenue curve in the quantile space, and you take the derivative with respect to Q, is going to be equal to the virtual value, but if you look at the virtual value in the quantile, which is phi of V of Q. And now if you think about the regular distribution, if your distribution is regular, then if I look at the R in the quantile space, which is the space of numbers between 0 and 1, then
Just depends on inverse value. inverse matrix theorem, what's that theorem of finding derivatives of inverse? This directly should work with that, right? You get.
I mean, it comes out of like algebra. I mean, I can do the
Yeah.
algebra, but I think there was a clean way of getting it from the payment equivalence, but I have to think about it. But trust me, this no holds. I mean, worst case is you can take the derivative and plug all the numbers in, and you will see that this is the case. But what matters for me is the implication. So if the distributions are regular, if you look at the revenue curve, then this is monotone increasing in value, and this value function is always monotone increasing, right? Because of the definition. If Q increases, that means V should decrease. So this is going to be a monotone decreasing function. So this is monotone increasing, this is monotone decreasing. So this function as a function of Q is going to be monotone decreasing, and therefore this is always concave. Let's say it has a shape of this. And this Q bar is basically going to be when the virtual value is equal to 2 here. You can say the virtual value at point V of Q bar is basically equal to 0 because of this part. Okay, so this is all we needed from the Morrison theory. So let's do actually some interesting stuff. Sequential posted price. This is a simple practical mechanism. How does it work? You have n buyers that arrive over time. We are in the online optimization class. This is the online part. So the n buyers arrive over time. The auctioneer sets a sequence of prices. Let's say P1, P2, all the way to Pn. So this is going to be the price that will be observed by the first buyer. This is going to be the price that's observed by the second buyer, so on and so forth. And we assume that buyer valuation distributions are known. And their sequence of arrival is known. The only thing that is not known is what their values are. So buyer value distributions are known. And imagining this is basically the sequence F1, F2, all the way to Fn. The problem is at time 1, the buyer is the valuation coming from distribution F1 arrives. At time 2, the buyer is valuation F2, so on and so forth. And your goal is to maximize revenue. Okay, so you want to pick these prices so that to maximize revenue. Recap to part 1 of the course. Recap. Part 1. We saw this model called profit inequality model, which was the following problem. For those that are new, let me actually try to quickly recap. So we have n agents, values, essentially V1 through Vn, where Vi is realized from distribution Fi, basically the same setting as before. But the objective function rather than revenue. Okay, so, and then the decision maker is setting a threshold. So decision maker sets thresholds say tau 1 all the way to tau n. Let's pick the first arriving buyer. such that the vi is greater or equal than tau I. So these values are realized one by one. You have a set of thresholds, tau 1 through tau n. And the decision maker has set this threshold so that if you pick the buyer, the first buyer whose value passes the threshold, you know that the expectation of the V of the winner is at least some fraction of the maximum value. That's the guarantee of the profit inequality algorithm. And you know how to solve these problems. So for example, what we saw in the previous lecture, in the previous course is that if I set tau 1 equal to tau 2, all the way equal to tau n, equal to, let's say, the expectation of the maximum value, max vi, divided by 2, then you can show alpha equal to half is achievable. Basically, if you set a threshold equal to the expected maximum value divided by 2, and you get to see these numbers the first time that the value exceeds the threshold, you pick that one, you know the expected value of the winner is at least half of the expected. That's just a recap. I mean, I can send the scribe notes of the property guide for those that are taking the course and they haven't taken the previous course. I'm not pushing that. But I was hoping that they can actually cover this result again, but in the interest of time, let me just think of it as a black box. So there's optimal stopping algorithm that if you set the threshold equal to this, then you get half approximation. But this is for the value. And now from what we saw, you want to design a simple pricing, sequential process pricing that maximizes revenue, in particular gets half of the optimal Myers function. How should we do that?
Replace values with whatever.
Yeah. As boring as it is very interesting to me. So the idea is, if you have a machinery like this that gives you, let's say, good approximation for maximizing quote unquote social welfare, the value, then you can use it in a black box fashion by using the Myerson theory and get the same result for revenue by just replacing these values with virtual values. So here is my, let's say, Myerson-based algorithm.
That is going to be our benchmark.
So I'm going to use both benchmark. I'm going to use Myerson theory to define both benchmark and the algorithm. Let me actually write down the algorithm first, and we're going to talk about the benchmark, and we'll see how this results in a black box fashion, and it will be the same approximation factor. But you're absolutely right that we need to think about the benchmark. So Myerson-based algorithm. And here's what we are going to do. So define a price P. If you define the price P such that I should find the price PI such that X phi of PI, the virtual value at price PI, is equal to the following quantity. Expectation of max over I, bi, bi, plus. So what is phi bi plus? So it is the positive part of the phi bi. So think of phi bi as a random variable. The phi, just as a recap, so phi of x is a function. It's equal to x minus 1 minus f of x, fi of x divided by the of x. Okay. Now, phi of vi is a random variable. I look at the positive part, then I look at the max of the positive part of virtual values across all the buyers. That defines a new random variable, and then I take expectation. Now, find the price pi such that phi pi is equal to this expectation divided by 2. Now, post prices P1, P2 to Pn sequential. So I'm going to post. And if it's not clear, so you have to apply the inverse of the virtual value to this thing to get the PI. And then I'm posting this thing sequentially buyers arrive. And the first time that the buyer clears her price, she's going to win the item and is going to pay the price. Okay. Now you can start writing down how much expected revenue you can get from these allocations, so on and so forth. But what can save you to really finding a very nice close form for this pricing mechanism? For the expected revenue of the price. Yes.
Can you compare it to the benchmark step by step, and then we shouldn't worry about the total revenue computing? Just saying at each step.
By step, I can just use something stronger than that to replace. I want to give a hint, but so the idea is
So it's a single item, right?
Yeah.
We sell it once and then we stop. So once it crosses the threshold, we stop.
What is your question?
so my question is, suppose you want to write an expression for the expected revenue of the posted pricing. And to just make your life easier, suppose I define I had to be the winner. So this is a random variable, right? So somebody is going to be there.
Isn't this changing VIs to phi of VIs and then the profit inequality?
Exactly, but let's do it as a step. So if I define I had to be the winner, then what will be the expected revenue of posted pricing? Just by using the payment equivalence.
It's this thing. It's this.
It's nothing but just expectation of phi I hat of v I hat. So this is the beauty of Microsoft framework. So it doesn't matter what allocation you look at. It doesn't need to be the optimal allocation. As long as you have an allocation rule that somehow decides on, hey, this buyer is going to win and this buyer is going to pay this much, and you know this is truthful, then you know the expected payments that you get from that buyer is going to be equal to the expected virtual value of that. Or do you have?
What is this just phi of I hat of pi hat? Because that's that thing, but you're saying that
Yeah, so basically imagine that I hat is the winner, it's random. So basically PIs are determining who is going to be the I hat.
Yeah.
And then what I'm saying is, you know, actually I have to look at replace the value of the buyer. So imagine my question was, what is the expected value you get? That would have the expectation of VI hat, right? If you think about the expected payment, it's going to be expectation of VI hat.
it's monotone by definition because of that.
And I'm slightly confused. So
Yeah.
that's the mechanism. It describes the allocation rule described by the first line. How is the payment for that allocation rule equal to this? So that's what you're using, right? Payment equals.
Right. So I'm encoding the payment in this definition. So there's this guy I had that is going to win. I don't know who is that person.
Yes.
So basically my allocation rule is that, well, so
they
even given a valuation profile, I hat is gonna be.
So they pay PI hat, right?
They do, but I'm not actually looking at the payment of I hat. In fact, this is actually equal to expectation of P of I hat. These two are equal to each other, but in a complex fashion.
I mean,
That's,
this is, the left thing is equal to the expected maximum of the positive part of the virtual values. Is that equal to?
How this is equal to that, right? That's the question. This is exactly, well, so I don't know how to explain. So basically, everything that we covered is proving this one equality.
Because this is BIC because of posted price and therefore everything else.
Posted pricing is BIC. Maybe I should have said that. Posted pricing by definition is BIC. Because, I mean, the first price is the first price. If the value is above the price, it's gonna accept. So posted pricing by definition is a BIC allocation. So if you see a price, if you're, so imagine that I run the posted pricing similar time auction. So I set a price. So usually the way that a buyer reacts to the price is that if the value of the buyer is above the price, you're going to accept. If it's a smaller price, you're going to reject. Now, suppose I ask you to report your value, and my allocation is the following. So if your report is above the price, I'm going to give you the item. If it's below the price, I'm going to decide to not give you the item. Then I claim no matter where your value is, you have no incentive to misreport. If your value is above the price, well, so if you report a larger number, it's not going to change your allocation rule. If you report a smaller number, as long as that smaller number is above the price, again, it's not going to change your allocation rule. So therefore, you are indifferent between all these choices above the price. And then if you go below the price, well, so you're not going to get the item. Therefore, your utility is going to be 0. But originally, your utility was positive. The difference between your value and the price. So therefore, that means you strictly prefer bidding your own value versus bidding something smaller than. Now, if your value is below the price, well, so you don't get the item if you bid truthfully. And you're indifferent between all the reports that are smaller than the price. The only thing that can change your outcome is if you bid above the price. In that case, you get negative utility because your value is smaller than the price. You have to pay the price this time. Your utility is going to be negative. Therefore, bidding truthfully strictly dominates all other reports above the price. So pricing by definition is a truthful mechanism.
Here, like disclosing your value means nothing because
basically, if the mechanism is pricing, the buyers can just disclose their value and trust the auctioneer that if the value of the price is giving the item is the right thing. So therefore, this complicated pricing mechanism at the end is going to have a winner by hat. And this is just an example of a BIC mechanism. And we know that for any BIC mechanism, the expected payment of the winner or expected revenue, basically we know the expected revenue is going to be the expectation of the sum of the payments of everyone. Here, only the winner pays, the other don't pay. So therefore, the expectation of PI hat is really the revenue. And we know it will always be equal to the expectation of the virtual value that is allocated. The only person that gets the allocation is I hat, and the virtual value of that person is PI hat or PI hat. So therefore, this is equal. So I don't really need to look at my prices. I should just look at the final allocated virtual value that gives me the expectation. Yes.
And by the expectation was expected of virtual values?
Oh, that was the payment, the Morrison's lemma, right? So we saw that the expectation of PI VI was equal to the expectation of the allocation rule XIVI times VIVI. And think of this as being like either 0 or 1. So this is basically, let me write it down. And then expected revenue was what? Expectation of the summation of XIVI, VIVI. and you can write it down as the expectation of, let's say, summation I. I'm looking at the ex post application. The idea. Right? So what is this quantity? This is basically how much virtual value you get from your allocation. Like for example, here, my allocation is that, hey, x I hat is 1, xi is 0 if I is not equal to I hat. This is the allocation that you get. And I hat is a random variable. I don't care, but this is my final allocation. So therefore, this summation is the phi I hat, vi hat. And then take expectation.
We should also include an indicator in both expectations
No.
in case I hat exists.
Good, that is true. So define I had to be the winner, and you're absolutely right that if there is no winner, which is the case that all the virtual values are negative, then I kind of assume that I hat is going to be equal to, let's say, 0.
You define
And I have this dummy buyer, so and the dummy buyer corresponding to I hat 0, where the phi 0 of v is always equal to 0. So I always add this dummy buyer in my head, and this is going to be one of the guys that I'm solving the profit inequality for. Right? So now why this mechanism theorem? The above pricing mechanism is two approximations to optimal Myerson mechanism. Why is that? So proof is kind of now immediate from everything else. Proof. Expectation of Myerson revenue is what? So you have n buyers. Each one has a virtual value phi vi. So the max of the virtual value than 0 is going to be the expectation of optimal Myerson. Include this dummy buyer. So therefore, you can say this is basic expectation of max over all i's, starting from 0, going all the way to n. 0 is the dummy buyer. Phi vi. This is what the optimal Myerson does, right? So you give the item to the guy that has a max virtual value. And let's call these guys xi. So this is going to be the expectation of max of xi's. Now think of an instance of the profit inequality problem where the random variables are x. Now consider an instance of profit inequality where variables are x0, x1, all the way to xn. So from this theorem, if you set a single threshold in this board on your x random variables at the threshold, so at the threshold with the x of the expectation of the max of xj's, j from 0 to n divided by 2, the threshold that you're using profit inequality. Then you know that if the winner, so that I had be the winner in the profit inequality problem. What do we know? So we know that then expectation of xi hat is going to be at least half of this quantity, the expectation of max xj, j from 0 to n. This part is we are using the profit inequality result. Now think of this benchmark. So what is this benchmark? What is the right-hand side? The expectation of the max. Is the revenue of the optimal marathon. Is the expectation of opt marathon revenue. And what is the left-hand side? Expectation of xi hat.
I mean, it's that thing.
It's the expectation of phi hat vi hat by definition, right? We call this thing xi. So this is the expected revenue of positive price. As long as this winner is the same winner. If this I hat is that I hat, then this is the expected of the revenue of the positive price. And now think of how I pick threshold. So here, if xi is above the threshold, you get that item, you get that value. And xi is phi vi, that means if phi vi is above the threshold, I'm going to accept. That means if vi is above the price such that phi is equal to that threshold, I should accept. And this is exactly how we set the price. You see what's happening? So in this instance of profit inequality, I hat is going to be some winner. In my pricing mechanism, I hat is going to be another winner. So these two winners are going to be stochastically the same winner. If you set the threshold such that the comparison in the profit inequality problem match the decision of the buyers in the pricing problem. So here, if an x is greater than the threshold, let's say xi is greater than t, we say this guy wins. And then xi is phi vi, so this is equal to phi vi greater or equal than t. That means that vi should be, because of the monotonicity of the virtual value, should be greater or equal than phi inverse of t. And this is basically what we call pi. Right? So this is t. This is pi. And as you see, the prices here match the threshold. So even though writing down a revenue function for sequential closed pricing seems to be complicated, I encourage you to try to write down the revenue function as function of P1 to Pm. And then working with that seemed to be complicated. When you directly work with the virtual values, things become immediate reduction to social welfare. And there you could use the profit inequality result to get the final amount. Yes.
How do we guarantee the PI exists? If it does not exist, we set them to infinity?
So there always exists a price at which phi is 0. And the reason for that is coming from regularity. So
Monopoly maximizing price as
yeah, so there is a price monopoly. So, so the revenue curve will always concave. So there's a point that gets its maximum, and their virtual value is 0.
You want VI PI to be large to be the right hand side. It is.
Oh, so your concern is maybe even
Yeah,
at infinity you can't meet this
Yeah,
quantity.
yeah.
Yeah, that's okay, right? You don't have to sell to someone. You can charge a equal to infinity to someone.
Okay.
Right, but
Okay. That's
I guess
yeah.
I guess Chan's concern is, well, so if this is monotone, strictly monotone increasing, so phi of infinity is going to be infinity, phi of there is a point where phi is 0, so therefore there always exists a pi such that it is equal to that.
Because the wrong side, even if it is not the case, you just don't sell.
Like if the support is less than t, so there is no such point, but then you just sort of don't sell.
Yeah, I guess that would be an example.
For example, for your domino.
Right, but I would argue that that cannot happen for all the buyers. Right, but for one particular buyer, you're right, that maybe that buyer is very weak, so never actually can pass the threshold. Then you just set pi to infinity and yeah. Yeah, so pi infinity means that you ignore a buyer, right? So the buyer can never get the item, but it cannot happen for all the items, for all the buyers. That's what I'm trying to say, because of the fact it's the expectation of the max of the expectation of the max of phi divided by 2. So at least there is a non-measured zero event that someone can pass this threshold. Right. All right, so now let's think about another pricing is a little complicated, so I'm going to switch to single item IID to just show you some other applications of this technology. So I'm just going to use the concept of revenue. And I post the results for those that are interested about single item case when you have non-iid buyers that are independent but not identically distributed, and how with one single price rather than different prices, you can get 4 approximations to optimal revenue using this Myers-Briggs technology. So a little bit complicated. The math is not clean. So in the interest of time, let me go to these 2 results, which are easier to talk about. But you get the idea of how to use the virtual values of revenue curves in order to design pricing mechanisms. I'll post that on campus. So what is this setting? The same setting as before. IID buyers, single item. And you wanna this time post the uniform price. Okay. I'm gonna start writing down a convex optimization. Imagine that the distributions assumption Vi is realized from F and F is regular. So now I'm going to write down the following convex optimization. I call it exante relaxation, similar to the exante relaxation that we saw last time. Of optimal revenue. So we are maximizing summation over I, R, of Qi, and to just recap, R of Q is defined to be Q times V of Q, and V of Q is the inverse CDF at the point 1 minus Q, aka the threshold such that the probability that X is greater than the threshold is equal to Q when X is realized from F. So I'm maximizing summation over I, R of Qi, such that summation of Qi is at most 1. Okay. So claim, and let's call this opt example. It's not the LP anymore. It's actually, if distributions are regular, these functions are concave, so this is a concave maximization. So claim expected revenue of optimal marathon auction is at most opt exact. How to prove this result? Quite simple. Suppose Qi star is the probability that optimal marathon allocates to I. Then we can say the expectation of payment of optimal marathon is going to be at most R of Qi star. Let me show you a proof by picture. Let me say this is the revenue curve. This is the point Qi star. Because of payment equivalence, you can say the expected payment that marathon gives to the expected payment of the winner I is, sorry, the expected payment of user I that might be winner or might not be is equal to the expectation of the probability that this user wins the Qi star times the virtual value at the point V of Qi star. Basically, this is again payment identity. Right, so basically, if I look at Qi star times the virtual value at Qi star, I take expectation, this is going to be the expected payment of the marathon auction. And we already discussed that there is a connection between revenue curve and virtual value. So the derivative of revenue curve is actually equal to the virtual value function. So we had this identity. Sometimes the virtual value is defined in this way. And now because of concavity, you see what's happening. So this is the slope of this line is going to be the virtual value. If you look at Q times this slope, basically this quantity is going to be Q times the virtual value. But then this quantity is the right-hand side, which is the R of Qi star. And because of concavity, this is always a smaller. no matter where you look.
It's an upper bound on the Myerson 70, right? Because like it could be even lower because phi is decreasing in Q. So I'm picking the what am I doing? Equal.
Phi is decreasing in Q, right? So it can be even negative. So if you're in this region, then this is even negative, but the right hand side is positive. If you are in this region, the right hand side and left hand side both of them are positive, but
So in this expression that you have E of Qi star, phi of B of Qi star, that's a bound on E of Pi, right? That's not equal. Is it equal?
oh, this is equal again because of the payment identity. Because this is the probability that Myerson allocates to this agent, and this is the virtual value.
But it could even be lower, right? Because I'm picking the highest QI fractal when E has this. So wait, I can ask it offline too.
Okay. But I mean, I'm just like basically thinking of this as the allocation function, and this is the.
This term will be the conditional virtual value given that you given the function.
But I'm taking other expectation and the same thing. I mean, I can unpack this and show you actual probability proof, but yeah, but this is equal to that. Just you need to carefully write down the expectation, and then we can see how allocation functions become the reduced form, the QI star, and then you get. Another way of thinking about this is the following. So basically, imagine I want to sell you an item. And then I say, okay, so the probability that I'm selling you the item is equal to QI star. Then the maximum expected revenue I can get to guarantee that the item is going to be allocated to you would be through a pricing mechanism. Therefore, you can say, well, so optimal Myerson is going to sell the item with some probability to each person. The exalted probability of sale is equal to QI star. Now I know that the item is going to go to person I with probability QI star. Then I could just say, okay, so maybe if I look at only this person and I make a one-to-one communication with the person that, hey, I'm going to sell you the item and the final probability to get the item is equal to QI star, how much revenue I can extract, then you get R of QI star. And you know that given a certain example allocation probabilities, the maximum revenue you can get is through the pricing mechanism, therefore the right hand side is greater than the left hand side. But I mean, I like this geometric proof a little bit. Yes?
Repeat the geometry.
So look at the Q star that times the phi of the Q star. So phi of Q star is the slope of this line. Okay. And what I'm saying is that if I multiply the slope of the line by Q star, then this is going to be the result. So this is the Q times the phi. But then the height of the point is R of Q star, and the height of the point is always a greater column.
And if that point is on the other side, what?
Then the left-hand side is negative, the right-hand side is some positive number, and automatically.
So it cannot be on the right hand side. I have a lower Q and the same R.
Right. It's not gonna. So basically, what Varun is saying is that yes, optimal Myerson never gives the item to anyone if the virtual value of that person is negative. That means that you never allocate to any Q after the peak of this function. So in some sense, if QSR is the probability that optimal Myerson allocate to I, we should only consider QIs that are corresponding to positive virtual value. But the interesting part is after. So this is an upper bound, and this is a simple concave program. It is actually pretty symmetric. The objective function is separable. We have the same functions. So what is the optimum solution? So if we solve expected LP, example LP, why do you call it LP? Because we had the linear program last time in the previous course. So example relaxation. then Q star, Qi star as a solution of the Qi star. Again, I think Qi star example is just going to be equal to 1 over n. Right? All right, so then I can say that opt example is equal to n times r of 1 over n. And this is equal to n times q1 over n times v of 1 over n. It is equal to v of 1 over n. Let's call this quantity to be a price P. Okay. If you post the price P equal to V of 1 over n, then expected revenue is price posting is going to be at least 1 minus 1 over E fraction of expected revenue of optimal marks. I already mentioned what is optimal marks in the symmetric setting. Let me say again. So basically, you have a certain threshold where this revenue curve is maximized, the value at which the revenue curve is maximized, V of the maximum point. So you want to give the item to the highest buyer only if the value of that highest buyer was above that threshold. That threshold is called monopoly price of the distribution. And this is the auction that maximizes the revenue. So you really need to run an auction and use the competition between the buyers in order to maximize the revenue. But this auction, the simple anonymous pricing, doesn't actually have any competition. So just post a price. If there is anyone who is willing to accept the price, you give the item to that guy, charge with price. And I claim that if you post this particular price, then the expected revenue you can get is at least 1 minus 1 over E times the expected revenue of optimal marks. And let's see why. Proof is kind of a single line. Suppose I post this price. My expected revenue, this time I'm not using revenue equivalence, I'm actually directly calculating this. Expected revenue of P would be equal to P times the probability that there exists a buyer VI such that VI is greater. So as long as there exists one buyer that is willing to pay the price, then you get the price, otherwise you get it. What is the probability of this event? So it is P times. The complement event is that all the values are smaller than P. So 1 minus product of probability that VI is smaller than P, I from 1 to n. What is this probability? So we know it is a quantity 1 over n. This probability is going to be 1 minus 1 over n. Therefore, this is P times 1 minus 1 over n to the power n. And we know this is greater or equal than P times 1 minus 1 over E because this quantity is upper bounded by 1 over E. But do we know what the optimal marks are? So we know expectation of the optimal milestone is at most the optimum solution of the ex-ante concave program. And we already saw it is exactly equal to T. And here you go. Let me show you another thing and then I'm gonna be done. So it is basically the setting when rather than 1 unit of an item, you wanna sell m units of the item. But again, you wanna use a uniform or anonymous price. So you are not allowed to pick different prices. So this time, non-iid buyers, m units. Okay. So I'm kind of repeating the same recipe. You can define example relaxation for this problem. So by the way, even in this setting, when you have m units, you can apply the optimal marathon technology. The only thing that will be different is the feasibility and variance. So previously, we were saying that the summation of xi should be at most 1. So exactly the same setting, but summation of xi can be at most n. So for example, what does optimal marathon do? It asks everyone to report their values, then transform the values to virtual values, then pick the top m non-negative virtual values. So for example, if there are more than m non-negative virtual values, it picks the top m1. If there is a smaller set, basically it picks the top m non-negative virtual values. And that's the allocation rule. You know it is monotone because of, again, the regularity of the distribution. And hence, because of the payment identity, there is a way to find the payments that make that incentive compatible. We don't care, but we know optimal marathon exists here, and that is the benchmark. Now you can write down the optimum exante similar to before, which is maximizing summation R of qi such that summation of qi this time is at most m because you're selling m items, qi is greater than 0. Without a proof, let me write down the two claims. So expected optimal marathon here is gonna be at most the optimal example. Claim 1. Now, what is the optimal solution? Again, this is a symmetric concave program. So the optimal solution is going to be at the symmetric point where this constraint is tight. So Q star I is going to be basically m divided by n. Therefore, opt exante is equal to summation over all i's r of m over n, which is, let's write it down, n times r of m over n, which is equal to n times the probability m over n times the value at the quantile m over n. This n cancels, and this is going to be m times v of m over n. All right. So now, again, we are going to call this our poster price P. Then number 2. If you post price P equal to V of m over n, post price P equal to V of m over n, then expectation of marathon's revenue, expectation of the revenue of posting pricing, revenue of price posting P would be at least, if I remember correctly, something like 1 minus e to the power minus m, m to the power n divided by n factorial times optimal marathon. And for those that are familiar with the Stirling approximation of the factorial, so this is basically the square root of 2 pi m times m over e to the power m. So this is roughly 1 minus 1 over a square root 2 pi m times optimal. Even though it seems very complicated, the proof is actually quite short. So how does this mechanism work? So you post one single price, you have m units of the product to sell. So people come, they see the price. Some people, they pass the price, some people don't pass the price. Let's say n is the number of people that pass their price. So I claim that the expectation of the revenue of the algorithm is exactly equal to P times the expectation of n. This is just by linearity of expectation. Why? Because revenue is equal to, as a random variable, is equal to summation over I from 1 to n, P times indicator I, where this is indicating whether the person gets the unit or not. When you take expectation, P comes out, and then you only get the expectation of n. Yes?
Didn't you, for example, say P times m expectation of n minus m plus, because n can exceed m.
N cannot exceed n.
Why?
My n is so number of people that pass the price and receive the item. So basically, if you run out of item, then I becomes automatically zero. But still, you can look at this, right? So what is the distribution of n? So it is a binomial random variable with parameter n and m over n. And let me just look at the asymptotic regime when n is large. So when n is large, then this guy is going to be a Poisson random variable with expectation n. So this is basically P times expectation of a Poisson with parameter n. Is it clear why this is binomial and then why the limit is Poisson? So because your count, so you have independent trials, each trial is going to happen with probability m over n, and you're counting how many successful trials you have. So that is the binomial distribution with n trials and success probability m over n. And this in the limit, as n goes to infinity, converges to a Poisson. But in fact, if you're curious, this is happening in the right direction. I'm not going to show it to you because of a stochastic dominance of binomial and Poisson. This is actually happening in this direction. Yes?
Do you think that binomial can be equal to n, but as you just said, we are restricting capital N to the received item?
Oh, you're right. And this is why this is not going to be n, right? Right. So this is going to be expectation of, you're right. N is the minimum of binomial and m, and I'm looking at the expectation of the minimum of m and the Poisson. Thanks for correcting me. This is why this is not equal to m, right? Everybody is equal to m. And I claim this is actually equal to that thing. Let me show that. So it is equal to the summation k from, let's say, 0 to m, k, and then probability that the Poisson with expectation m is equal to k. It's gonna be e to the power minus m to the power k divided by k factorial. And now after m, I should just use m, right? Because I'm for the minimum of m and Poisson. So it's gonna be k from m plus 1 to infinity, m times e to the power minus m to the power k divided by k factorial.